Hi everyone, in today's video I have this 132 scale Jada Toys 1967 Shelby GT-500 diecast, which I plan to turn into the Shovelface from the Mad Max video game. Now if you've never played the Mad Max video game, it's pretty much set in the Mad Max universe. Max loses the Interceptor and is forced to build a new car called the Magnum Opus. One of the features of the Magnum Opus is it can switch out the bodies, and they all have different names, but they're all based on real life cars. For this video we're focusing on the Shovelface, which is based on a 67 Mustang or thereabouts. I'm not entirely sure which year it is, but I'm pretty sure it's a 67, but that's what I'm using anyway, so here we go. I start by taking the diecast apart by undoing the two screws underneath. After this, the diecast simply just pulls apart. Next I remove the lights, grill and bumper, which are all melted in place, and just by cutting the ends of the pegs off on the inside with my hobby knife, and then they'll just fall out. I plan to glue them back in place anyway when I've got to put them back on. For the glass, I found with the Jada diecast they usually rivet their glass in place. Now if you're going to keep this, you're best off drilling this out. But I don't intend to do that, so I can just rip it out without really worrying about any damage caused by tearing it out. Following this, I plan to cut a hole in the hood. So I've drilled these two pallet holes with my power drill. And then afterwards I'm going to use my jeweler saw to cut out a square shape, like so. So you can see I've done the cutting off camera. I do need to fill this pallet hole with some green stuff, but I'll do that later on. I also cut out the trunk section. As you can see, the metal's quite thick here, and I had a really tough time doing this, and I think I went through about 20 blades. As you can also see, it's a very rough cut. I did try and clean this up with some files, but it was just not having it. For this reason, I won't be cutting the front to match the car in game, just because the front is just the same thickness and it will just be a nightmare for me, since it'll be too difficult and I'll more likely just lose all interest in finishing the project. So I'd rather just leave the car as is and just have it more of a tribute build than a 100% accurate build. Next I needed an engine because the diecast didn't come with one, so I took this one from a 132 scale Tamiya German tank engine maintenance crew kit. I've already disassembled the housing, but I do need to trim some more off to get it to fit. So I start with my hobby knife and just trim off the tabs for the housing. I then use my jeweler's saw to remove the rear section of the engine. After a quick test fit, I realised I need to take some more off, so I use the jeweler's saw again to remove the side sections of the engine. In an effort to make the engine look a lot more like the one in game, I remove the two air filters on the top here and then just trim this down a bit. With that done, I glue the engine in place with some super glue. And then gluing one of the air filters back on top of the engine. And now we have something that looks a lot closer to the one in game. Next I move on to the interior, and I start by trimming off all the raised detail because originally there was an interior tub on top of this, but I don't intend to use that, so I'm just going to cut everything so I've got a nice reasonably flat surface to work from. For the driver's seat, I'm using a Lego seat, which I'm just going to remove the studs off with some sprue cutters. Following this, I put the body back on so I can put the chair in just in the right position and then just I did dollop with super glue to keep it in place. Following that, I then just put a layer of super glue all the way around to make sure this is securely in place. Now off camera, partially because I just forgot to record this unfortunately, I rebuilt the wheel arches because they were only half, because again the original interior tub kind of covered these, but I don't intend to use that piece, so I had to rebuild these with some styrene. I just cut some pieces and just basically bent them into shape, and it was quite simple. I also filled in these holes with some green stuff from bits I'd removed from the base, and then just had some tape on the other side to stop the green stuff from leaking out. Unfortunately the green stuff didn't really work, because as soon as I removed the tape off it pulled the green stuff off. So instead I'm going to use some baking soda and some super glue. Again, I've used tape on the other side, and I'm just going to sprinkle some baking soda on and then put some super glue over the top. Next I make a start on some axle tubes using some styrene tube. Once I cut these to length, I split the tubes in half down the middle. So I can slot these over the original metal axles, because the original wheels I'm using, I think they're from the Jada Fast and Furious Jeep. I can't remember the name, but the name will probably be up. I can then super glue these to the base and still have the wheels free rolling. I also add some baking soda and super glue just to kind of strengthen the bond, and I also do this to the front axle as well. Now in game the car has what I would call roll bars on the outside, but it's called armour in game, and so for this I'm just going to bend and cut some styrene rod, which I bend into shape with my needle nose pliers. Quick test fit reveals I need to trim some of it down. I then attempt to super glue this to the body, but as super glue is, it gets fiddly and sticks to everything. This is why I call it super annoying glue, because it sticks to everything but what you want it to stick to. But there you go, that's how it works, isn't it? After this I go ahead and just do the same for the other bars, and as you can see here the finished result. Next I decided to make the ram on the front, which is also known as a ramming grill in game. To start with I draw out the triangle piece on a sheet of styrene. Once I've cut this out, I trace around it to make the second one. And then tape the two pieces together and use a file just to make sure they're both even. While taped together, I also drill in the holes for the bars in the front. After this I begin attaching the front bumper to the body. Unfortunately, as you can see, when I'm trying to thread the bars through the holes, it's kind of knocking everything. So I leave this to one side for the glue to cure, and then I just put the bars on later. And here you can see the finished bumper. Next I want to add some more detail to the rear axle. So for this I'm going to use a bead to act as the differential. I split this in two with some sprue cutters, which I then glue into position. Back to the body, I need to fill in these side pipes that have been moulded into the body, and for this I'm just going to use some liquid green stuff and use an old hobby knife to kind of apply it on, as you can see. Following this I go back to the axle and make the rear leaf springs. So first I cut this C-shaped styrene to be the brackets, and glue these either side of the wheel wells. Next I cut some lengths of styrene sprue to act as the leaf springs, and I bend these in the middle to give them that kind of curve, and then glue these in place over the axle. After this I make the driveline or drive shaft, for which I just use a piece of styrene rod. Once again I cut and bend this into shape and glue it into position. So going to the front, I make a start on the wishbones and I use some square styrene rod for these. I tried bending these into shape, but unfortunately as you can kind of see they kind of crack around the corners, which I'll fix with some green stuff later on. And then cut these at an angle so they can mount them at an angle. And I then glue these over the front wheels. Going back to the rear diff, I glue this little circle piece from my scraps box in place to act as the diff cover, as you would see on a real differential on a rear axle. So going back to the front, I don't really like the look of this metal bar because obviously that's not really realistic, and to kind of hide this I decided to add a skid plate, which isn't a part of the actual car in game, but it would logically make sense because a skid plate is there to protect your engine when you're going over rough terrain, and basically rocks and other bits of rough terrain would bounce off of this instead of your oil pan or anything part of your steering. So for this it's just a piece of square styrene that I've already cut and then bend it in shape. To add some more detail, or specifically where, I use my file and just gouge it out and make it look like it's been already driven over some rough terrain, and then had a few chunks taken out of it. And then glue this on top of the axle. After this I make some chocks for the front using some styrene rod. After marking and cutting these into length, I then take some copper wire and wrap them around to act as the coils. After this I then glue this into position, which takes a little nudging to get it in the right spot. Although with the finished result is not very visible, you can kind of see it at the right angles, and when I paint this up it'll look a little different from the actual body colour. Next I focus on the interior, making the gear shifter out of some styrene rod, and just kind of cut this to length. So I just mark this out, cut it to length, and then bend it into shape, and a quick test fit to make sure it doesn't catch on anything and it looks right. And then cut a small piece of styrene tube and glue that in place over the top just to kind of act like the head of the gear stick. Now onto the rear roll cage. I start by marking out, cutting and then bending into shape some styrene rod. And then do some test fitting, and unfortunately this doesn't go as planned, and after several tries and failed attempts, as you can see on the table here, I end up going with this one piece instead of making it several smaller pieces and gluing it all together. I then use some super glue to glue this onto the body, and use some clamps to keep everything held together until the glue cures. So I continue making the roll cage on the interior section and just mark where I need to make the cuts and the bends, and just keep test fitting, making the bends and trimming here and there until everything looks just right. and then finally I just glue this in place. The next step is to make the side pipe exhausts, as you can see here by the finished one. To make this, I measured, cut and then bent into shape a piece of styrene rod. And as you can see here, I realised I've just made the exact same one, so luckily I can just kind of bend this one end the other way and it looks alright, and I can put this on the other side. Just trim off a little of the excess here. I need to hollow out the end, so I use my hobby knife and just use a circle motion to kind of hollow out the end for the exhaust tip. And then glue this into position. So next I need to focus on the doors. Now as you can see with the one I've done here, I've added some little styrene pieces to make it look like the inner door skin. Now this isn't 100% realistic looking, but to cut something that looks realistic, it's a lot of detail for something that's really rarely going to be seen. So I've just made this very simple but effective version instead. To make this I cut some lengths of styrene and then just glue it up together like so, although I have to keep moving this around the cutting board because the glue is seeped through little gaps and it will fix itself to the cutting board if I don't move it around. Once that's cured, I can then glue this to the other door using some super glue. Now for the final part of this build, I decided to make the side burners. Now these are a feature in the game that shoot flames out the side of the car to stop people from jumping onto your car or just to deal with anyone who's beside you. And these are quite simply made out of a piece of styrene rod and a piece of styrene tube. You simply just bend the styrene rod and then you add the styrene tube on the end, as you can see here. And then I just glue these into position just in front of the exhausts because they're just set just behind the front wheels. Now moving on to the painting section. Now again, I usually use Revell Aquacolor for most of my colours. So I start with a base coat of Revell Rust for the whole body of the car and the chassis. Following this, I stipple on some Revell Leather Brown onto the bottom side. I did try using the sponge technique, but it wasn't really effective, so I just went with the old stippling technique instead with a brush. And then do the same for the body. After that, I then take some Bron, which is like a browny orange, and stipple that on to add to the rust effect. After this, I felt it didn't quite match the in-game car, because the in-game car's rust is kind of a reddish brown. So I took some red and some brown and mixed up my own like reddish brown rust, and then stippled that on over the top and was much happier with the way that looked. So you kind of see from the still image here, the car was originally white but the rust has kind of taken it over, so I wanted to try and replicate this effect by stippling on some Revell Matte White, but as I was going over it I was feeling like I was kind of ruining this. So afterwards I went back over it with some of the red rust colour again, and it kind of does bleed through, but I think it's too subtle an effect and I don't know if it was really worth bothering with. So after this I used the sponge chipping technique to add some Revell metallic silver, just to kind of replicate the scuffs and scrapes as you kind of see on the in-game car. Next I tried to replicate the rust flames, and for this I cut out a stencil and then just stippled on some Revell leather brown. After this I then paint the bars with some, again, Revell metallic silver, and then dry brush on some Revell matte black onto the bumper and the engine. I also paint the gear stick, handlebar and dashboard with Revell matte black. I paint the driver's seat with some Revell tank grey. For the shocks I use some Revell light blue. Again I use some more Revell metallic silver for the air filter. I also paint the side pipes with this colour. I then paint the side burners with some Revell Bron, as well as the wheels. After this I go over the interior with the red rust mix I made, and then dry brush on some silver, just to kind of look like scratches and scuffs and basic wear and tear. And then finally I finish it off with a black wash. And here's the finished result. So I didn't do what I usually do, which is to paint the body with a black wash as well. I only did the interior, chassis and engine bay, just because I felt it would probably ruin the look, and I got the car quite close to how the original in-game car looks, so I didn't really want to ruin it. Looking back, I now realise I've made a few mistakes because I was building this from memory. The wheels, side pipes and side burners are more things you unlock mid-game, and I was trying to make an early game version of the car. Specifically the jack, if you can see in this still image here. Obviously it's got a different set of wheels on it, doesn't have the side pipes and it doesn't have the afterburners, but I was mostly making this from memory and just images I'd gotten from the internet. Either way, I'm still quite happy with the way it turned out. I do want to build some of the other car bodies that they have in the game, and I'll do those as soon as I find suitable cars. Chances are I probably won't be able to do the one that's based on the Interceptor, because finding a 73 Ford Falcon is pretty much impossible. Even if you're a Mad Max fan, there's only so many of those things made in so many scales. I don't think I'd find one in this scale or any other scale. Anyhow, I felt this turned out pretty great, with all things considered, especially the real rusted flames. I'm really proud of how that turned out, because it was the first time making my own template. And I was a bit worried that the paint would bleed out and get everywhere and just ruin the entire finish, but it didn't, thankfully. So that's something you'll probably see in the future of me using stencils and hopefully coming up with some really cool paint jobs. So like usual, stick around for the glamour shots and enjoy the short animation I've made of this one. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you all in the next one.